1846. James K. Polk is the 11th President of the United States. America is at war with Mexico. The Oregon Treaty is signed with England, paving the way for Oregon to become a territory of the United States. Henry David Thoreau is living in a small cabin on Walden Pond, an experience he will later write about, which will become a classic in American literature. The man who will later be known as Buffalo Bill Cody is born. The Smithsonian Institution is founded by an act of Congress. The Liberty Bell is rung for the last time due to a large, threatening crack that has developed. And in Fall River, Massachusetts, a church that will one day be known as the Baptist Temple is born. In 1781, a spiritual revival began in Tiverton, Rhode Island, and quickly spread into Fall River and the surrounding communities, resulting almost immediately in the formation of a church that would by 1836 be known as the First Baptist Church. For 65 years, from 1781 until 1846, the Baptist witness in Fall River emanated from that church. In 1840, the First Baptist Church built a building on Main Street. The ornate structure was called the Baptist Temple, which the First Baptist Church occupied for 6 years. In 1843, fire ravaged that part of the city, and although the new building survived undamaged, many surrounding homes and buildings were destroyed. The downtown was soon rebuilt, with many mills and industries replacing the formerly residential area. Fall River was changing and growing, and so was the First Baptist Church. How and why that first church in 1846 birthed the Second Baptist Church, which later became known as the Baptist Temple, is a story that needs to be told and remembered. For Baptist Temple's past is glorious, and its future is in God's hands. During the 1830s and 40s, two controversial and divisive issues were hotly debated in the industrialized northern states. These two issues weighed heavy on the heart of Asa Bronson, pastor of the First Baptist Church of Fall River. The first was the issue of slavery. Abolitionist rallies were common occurrences in New England, the hotbed of the abolitionist movement. Former slave and New Bedford resident Frederick Douglass traveled extensively in New England and the northern states, lecturing at these gatherings. It is highly likely that Pastor Bronson, a passionate abolitionist, attended these rallies, and perhaps heard Mr. Douglass himself speak on the issue.
What shall we do with the Negro? I have had but one answer from the beginning. Do nothing with us. Your doing with us has already played the mischief with us. If the Negro cannot stand on his own legs, let him fall also. All I ask is, give him a chance to stand on his own legs. Let him alone. If you see him on his way to school, let him alone. If you see him going to the ballot box, let him alone. Don't disturb him.
A second issue, the long working hours in the mills, had long stirred in Pastor Bronson's spirit. Fall River, being one of the largest textile-producing cities in the country, had many mills, which employed thousands of the poor and working class of the city, many of them children. Pastor Bronson's convictions and his outspokenness on the need to reduce the workday from 13 hours to 10, in addition to his abolitionist views, added to a growing division between members of his congregation and other churches in the community.
I always was amazed at the first pastor of the church, Asa Bronson. He was pastor of the First Baptist Church, actually, and had become quite concerned with the labor conditions in the mills. And he took a stand again and again and again in the working men's paper, insisting that they should have time to not only attend church and that type of pursuit, but they also should have time to minister to their own families and share devotions and so on from the Bible. And so he was pushing that the 13-hour day be reduced to at least 10. He was way ahead of his time. But the problem was that some of the barons of the mills were part of First Baptist Church. And so he began to realize that if he continued to push his convictions, that he could well split the congregation. So he left the First Baptist Church. He went to upstate New York. And after he left, the working class people of the church asked permission if they could start another congregation. Permission was granted, and in fact, First Baptist Church sold their almost new property on Main Street to the new congregation.
Asa Bronson was born in upstate New York in 1798. Though little is known about his immediate family, the extended family was apparently well-to-do, owning properties in both New York and Connecticut. Two of Asa's close relatives would distinguish themselves in their professions. Green C. Bronson, a prominent lawyer and judge, became the Attorney General of New York in the late 1820s and 30s. Henry F. Bronson, a lumberman by trade, immigrated to Canada and was responsible for converting the large lakes and waterfalls of the Ottawa River into a channel for the driving of sawn logs from the wilds of Canada to the sawmills miles away downriver. Asa, however, had a higher calling, and in his early 20s assumed the pastorate of a church in Stratfield, Connecticut, a position he held through the 1820s and the early 30s. On April 4, 1833, Asa came to Fall River, then called Troy, to become the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Troy. In 1834, Troy, Massachusetts changed its name to Fall River, Massachusetts, and 2 years later, the church officially became known as the First Baptist Church of Fall River. Pastor Bronson served through these various name changes and retained his pastoral position until 1844, when he resigned. While Baptist Temple Church's records show that Second Baptist Church was formed over the issues of labor in the mills, According to the records from the First Baptist Church, the issue of slavery and the church's official response to it was also a major factor in Bronson's decision to leave the First Baptist Church after 11 years of service. On September 23, 1844, First Baptist Church voted on 6 resolutions that had been discussed and debated in the church through that previous summer. Those resolutions read as follows. Resolution number 1. Resolved that this church as an independent body feel bound to bear unequivocal testimony against the abominable sin of American slavery. Resolution number 2. Resolved that we will not invite or allow a slaveholding minister to occupy the pulpit, nor invite or allow a slaveholder to commune with us as a church. Resolution number 3. Resolved that we will not invite or allow any minister who is an advocate of slavery to occupy our pulpit, or invite or allow any advocate of slavery to commune with us as a church. Resolution number 4. Resolved that the third resolution should not be so construed as to cut off those who are abolitionists, but who may differ from us as to the best means to be employed for the exterminating of the evils of slavery. Resolution number 5. Resolved that the pastor of this church is requested at each succeeding communion to give the invitation in accordance with the above resolutions. Resolution number 6. Resolved that if after the adoption of the foregoing resolutions, any members of this church feel their privilege or duty to commune with any slaveholding or pro-slavery church, the responsibility rests on themselves. We will not make it an act of church discipline, but will leave it as a matter of conscience between them and their God, to be settled on the day of final adjudication. Only 2 of the resolutions passed as written, and 1 was amended. The others were rejected. Pastor Bronson, unhappy with the final vote results and conscious of the remaining conflicts over the labor issues, resigned that evening and shortly returned to Albany. A newspaper editorial, dated September 28, 1844, clearly shows the feeling of many in the community regarding Pastor Bronson, and also of the growing discord. It is with much pleasure that we announce that Reverend A. Bronson, the true and tried friend and able advocate of the working man, is to give another lecture to us before he removes from town. A few of our aristocratic manufacturers, who love wealth more than justice, have raised themselves up in their imaginary greatness against him, and he has thought it best, in order to keep peace in the church, to leave this and go to another field of labor. Despite Bronson's departure, the divisive issues remained, and between April and June of 1846, unanimous approval was given by First Baptist Church for 149 members to form a new church to be called the Second Baptist Church of Fall River. Asa Bronson was immediately called in May of 1846 to return to pastor the new church, which held their Sabbath meetings in the town hall. Led by Pastor Bronson, Deacons Charles and Joseph Borden, and Clerk John Milne, the Second Baptist Church also secured the use of the vestry of the Universalist Church on 2nd Street and held meetings there every night of the week except on Sunday. A year later, either due to the changes on Main Street that had occurred after the fire of '43, or because they were already outgrowing the building, First Baptist agreed to sell their 6-year-old Baptist Temple building to the new church and relocate to the northern part of the city. The Second Baptist Church held their first church service in the Baptist Temple building in October of 1847. During Bronson's ministry, the church grew, with hundreds of converts baptized and added to the church membership. He was a well-recognized and respected member of the community, and because of this respect, he was commonly referred to as Father Bronson by those outside the church. In 1855, he saw one of his sons, John, ordained as a minister by the Second Baptist Church. Asa Bronson resigned his pastorate of the Second Baptist Church in September 1857, serving 11 years and 3 months. He died on November 29th, 1866, at the age of 68. Abraham Hart, the church's first historian, wrote that at Bronson's funeral, Deacon Enoch French leaned over the pulpit and, looking down at the coffin, quoted from Genesis 5:24. Enoch walked with God and was not, for God took him. Asa Bronson, too, was a man who walked with God. With Bronson's departure in 1857, many church members were anxious about the future. They had loved and respected their old patriarch. Who could possibly take his place? In February of 1858, after a search of 5 months, Charles A. Snow, newly graduated from the Newton Theological Seminary, assumed the pastoral duties of the Second Baptist Church. Though ordained by the church shortly after his arrival, some in the congregation were still unsure about their new pastor. Abraham Hart wrote in 1896 that Pastor Snow was a man of discretion and possessed a calm spirit. He quickly won the respect and admiration of those he had come to serve. 1861. Jefferson Davis is inaugurated as the first President of the Confederate States of America. Abraham Lincoln is inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States of America. Tensions between the industrialized North and the agrarian South had reached the breaking point, and with the firing on Fort Sumter, the divided nation was at war with itself. Hart writes in his history that the fife and drum could be heard in the streets, even on Sundays, beckoning men to enlist to help restore the Union. Pastor Snow responded to his country's call, and after seeking permission from his congregation, took a leave of absence from his duties at the church and served for 9 months as a chaplain in the Union Army. Years later, Abraham Hart interviewed some of the men who served with Pastor Snow. They described Snow as a manly man and a faithful chaplain, full of sympathy and kindness, to officer and enlisted alike. During his leave of absence, men of the church, guest speakers, and for several weeks the revivalist Erland Patterson assumed his duties at home. At the conclusion of his military service, Pastor Snow returned to the pulpit at Second Baptist Church. It was during this time that the Franklin Hall Sunday School ministry was started. This ministry later became the Third Baptist Church of Fall River. Pastor Snow left Second Baptist Church on October 20th, 1864, after 6.5 years of faithful and productive service. One interesting piece of historical information that occurred during Pastor Snow's time has recently come to light. A 20-year-old church member, Joseph Milne, followed Pastor Snow's example and answered his country's call to serve in the Union Army during the Civil War. Second Lieutenant Milne was present at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 3, 1863. Lieutenant Milne took charge after his commanding officer was killed during the battle. Milne soon received a fatal wound when a Confederate minie-ball struck him in his right lung. Though he lingered for another 6 days, he died before his mother was able to reach him. His last words were, "Tell my mother I died, doing my duty. On July 24th, 1863, Pastor Snow conducted a funeral service for Lieutenant Milne at the Baptist Temple building. Second Baptist Church's choirs sang, "Lay Me Down Gently, Boys." A funeral procession, including some Army comrades, marched up to Oak Grove Cemetery, where he was laid to rest. Little information is available on Second Baptist's next two pastors. Reverend John Duncan arrived 3.5 months after Pastor Snow's departure and remained until June of 1870. The historian Abraham Hart describes him as a faithful preacher, an able theologian, and a perfect gentleman. With Pastor Duncan's departure, the church entered into a period of almost 1.5 years without a shepherd. In November of 1871, Reverend Frank R. Morse of Lowell, Massachusetts, became Second Baptist Church's 4th pastor. He stayed only 16 months and, according to Hart, was criticized only for the brevity of his pastorate. The church entered another long period, this time 19 months, of being without a leader. Reverend Henry C. Graves assumed the pastorate of Second Baptist Church on October 4th, 1874. During his tenure as pastor, there was a period of great financial depression. However, it was also a period of a great ingathering of souls. Meetings conducted at the church by the famed Moody and Sankey revivalist George Frederick Pentecost and hymn leader George Stebbins added an additional 111 members to the church.
I've noted in reading various parts of the history of Baptist Temple Church that there were times of revival. And in researching part of that history, I discovered that there was a fantastic crusade that took place for 7 weeks back in 1878. Although it wasn't originating within Baptist Temple itself, the building was the venue for this revival. George Pentecost was the evangelist and George Stebbins was the song leader. And it wasn't unusual for these men to come to a city and soften the ground for the coming of Moody and Sankey. And there were times as well that they would go directly to smaller cities that Moody and Sankey would never have the time to come and preach and give energy to. And so it was in that particular year that Pentecost approached the city and asked that he might come and hold a crusade. The city was negative. They opposed it. It seems that that particular era there was a great deal of disputes regarding the mills and politics, and people were at odds with one another. As far as the city fathers were concerned, this was not a time for a religious crusade. But Pentecost insisted, and he came even though they did not want him. And the meetings were, as I said, held at Baptist Temple. And over that 7-week period, tremendous things happened. Not only was the church filled night after night, day after day, but I was amazed to realize on one occasion when only men could attend, over 1,200 men filled the place to hear the gospel of Christ. And by the time the 7 weeks were over, so many people in areas throughout the city had come to Christ that they began to make reconciliation with others with whom they had differences. And because of that crusade, the city really found peace and unity, and were able to move ahead together into the future.
Pastor Graves left Second Baptist Church in 1880 to become the pastor of the First Church of Haverhill. The historian Abraham Hart comments that at his departure he was held in high esteem both in the church and in the city as a scholarly Christian gentleman and minister. 2 months after Pastor Graves' departure, a call was extended to a promising young seminary student from Newton Theological Seminary, Ebenezer Hunt. The call was accepted, and in September of 1880 the church ordained him as a minister of the gospel. He was quickly recognized as a thoughtful and able speaker, preferring to preach entire sermons without note or pulpit. Many were of the mind that he would soon become one of the leading ministers within the denomination. Despite his obvious gifts, Pastor Hunt apparently was less than diplomatic in his dealings with some members of the congregation, and those members, according to Hart, for their part, were very uncharitable towards Pastor Hunt. His pastorate ended under a considerable cloud of unpleasantness after only 27 months, and resulted in the revision of the rules and regulations of the church, where leadership and responsibilities were given to a larger number of the men of the church. In February of 1884, Reverend George W. Guile of Pittsfield, Massachusetts, assumed the position of pastor of the Second Baptist Church. He brought with him, according to Hart's account, a prudent diplomatic spirit, preaching power, and immense business ability. Under Pastor Guile, the church membership grew by 200. The church building was improved, a chapel was rebuilt, and a parsonage was purchased. There was also a substantial increase in giving to both home and foreign missions. Sermons, lectures, and Sunday school excursions were appreciated by all. The church even hosted the Baptist State Convention and other official anniversaries and ceremonies during Pastor Guile's tenure. After 8 years at Second Baptist Church, Pastor Guile tendered his resignation in order to accept a position as business manager at Colby Academy for Women in New London, New Hampshire. The periods of hardship experienced by the church since 1870 was brought to an end under Pastor Guile. But God had planned even better days ahead. 1893. Grover Cleveland begins his second term as President of the United States. A crash on the New York Stock Exchange causes what history remembers as the Panic of 1893. With the departure of Pastor George Guile, God, in His providence, chose to bless the Second Baptist Church with a gifted and dynamic preacher, a caring and compassionate shepherd, and a devoted and faithful leader. David B. Jutten was born in New York on January 7, 1844, to Benjamin and Emma Jutten. In 1867, he married Elizabeth Cooper, and together they had 3 children, Chauncey, Llewellyn, and Emma, who was named after his mother. An empowered and energetic preacher, young David pastored a church while in college and another while attending the Hamilton Theological Seminary in Hamilton, New York, from which he graduated in 1870. During the next 23 years, Reverend Jutten pastored churches in Washington, New York, and Boston. In 1893, at the age of 49, he arrived in Fall River to assume his final pastoral post, and the one which he held longer than any other, at the Second Baptist Church. Pastor Jutten soon became a well-loved and respected member of the church and the community at large. Newspapers of the day referred to him as public-spirited and community-minded. Membership in the church grew as well, with a total of 764 reported in 1909. It was not unusual for over 1,000 people to come on any given Sunday to hear Pastor Jutten's fiery and energetic preaching. It was common to see him pacing back and forth, rarely standing behind the pulpit, rarely looking at the sermon notes, completely oblivious to anything that might distract him, captivating his listeners with the pure truth of Scripture. One church member became so concerned over Pastor Jutten's total absorption in his presentations that he purchased a brass railing for fear that Pastor Jutten would plummet from the platform during the delivery of one of his sermons. It was during Pastor Jutten's tenure in 1896 that the Franklin Hall Mission, begun during Pastor Snow's ministry, became the Third Baptist Church. Also in 1896, the church marked its 50th anniversary. Former pastors Snow, Morse, Graves, and Guile were all in attendance. At the time of the celebration, 21 original church members were still living, 13 had remained members, and 10 were present at the 50th anniversary celebration. Church historian Abraham Hart was also present. In 1907, Pastor Jutten presided over the funeral of this dear saint, who prudently recorded the early history of the church that is now known as the Baptist Temple. In April of 1908, the church celebrated Pastor Jutten's 15th year as their pastor. The Honorable Andrew Jennings, prominent lawyer, church member, and new church historian, was present, as was Robert A. Bogle, the grandfather of longtime member and current church clerk Barbara Bogle. In 1909, after 16 years in the pulpit at Second Baptist Church, failing health caused Pastor Jutten to reluctantly resign his post as pastor. At a farewell banquet given in his honor, he and his wife Elizabeth were presented with a loving cup and a purse of gold. So ended the public ministry of a gifted and remarkable servant of Christ. He returned to South Boston, where he lived in relatively poor health until his death on May 7, 1913. Pastor Jutten returned to the people and the city he loved for one last time. After a funeral service in the Baptist Temple building, his remains were laid to rest at Oak Grove Cemetery, just a short walk from the gravesite of Asa Bronson. Two of Second Baptist Church's members will be forever remembered in history as having been involved in one of the greatest unsolved murder mysteries of modern times. It was during Pastor Jutten's time in 1892 and 93 that the famous murders of Andrew and Abby Borden and the subsequent trial of Lizzie Borden occurred. Attorney Andrew Jennings, the church member who assumed the role as church historian after Abraham Hart's death, had long been the Borden family attorney, handling mostly business affairs. Upon the arrest of Lizzie Borden, Andrew Jennings was the first defense attorney involved in the case. It was Andrew Jennings who delivered the opening statement at Lizzie's trial. Because his experience in criminal cases was minimal, he persuaded attorney George Robinson to take the lead in her defense. He remained on the defense team throughout the duration of the trial. Andrew Jennings died on October 19, 1923. He too is buried in Oak Grove Cemetery. Abraham Hart, Second Baptist Church's first historian, also had an active role with the Borden family. Hart was the treasurer of the Union Savings Bank, for which Andrew J. Borden also served as an officer. Hart was called to give testimony during both the preliminary and the final trials in regards to a meeting he had had with Andrew J. Borden on the morning of August 4, 1892. Andrew Borden was found murdered later that same day. In October of 1909, a young and eloquent preacher from the Alexander Avenue Baptist Church in New York City became the Second Baptist Church's 9th pastor. Frederick W. Blakesley brought with him the organizational skills that would be needed during this time. Church records and membership rolls were updated, including the dismissal of 44 members in 1916 who formed the North Tiverton Baptist Church, which began as the Temple Mission years earlier under Pastor Guile. Main Street was widened, which necessitated the rebuilding of the storefronts, a reduction in the size of the auditorium, the addition of second-floor offices, and the construction of a new front entrance. It was during Pastor Blakely's tenure that Europe, and later America, became engaged in what was called the Great War. In 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm II invaded Belgium, and Europe was thrust into war. America joined the fray in April of 1917, and men from the Second Baptist again answered their country's call, and bled and died on French and Belgian soil. In July of 1918, Reverend J. Wallace Chesbrough assumed the pastorate of Second Baptist Church. By November, the war to end all wars had ended. In 1921, at Second Baptist Church's 75th anniversary, church historian Andrew Jennings wrote that Pastor Chesbrough preached the gospel earnestly and won the hearts of the people by his zealous performance of his duties and manifestation of his true Christian manliness. Pastor Chesbrough's ministry at Second Baptist Church came to a close on December 31st, 1924. 1925. Calvin Coolidge is the 30th President of the United States. Schoolteacher John Scopes is arrested for teaching evolution and sets off what the world will remember as the Scopes monkey trial. From the land of Nova Scotia via Ipswich, Massachusetts, came Reverend Samuel A. McDougall. On November 29, 1925, Dr. McDougall ascended to the pulpit to preach his first sermon as the new pastor of Second Baptist Church. Who knew at that time that he would be its last? On April 5, 1926, Pastor McDougall was presented with a brand new automobile by church member Joseph Dickinson. The event was covered in the newspaper the following day. 9 days later, Second Baptist Church and Samuel McDougall would again be in the newspapers. On April 14th at 3:30 a.m., the Baptist Temple building, built in 1840 and the home of the Second Baptist Church for 77 years, was destroyed by a devastating fire. Pastor Jutten's brass railing was the only item pulled from the debris that was salvageable. Though offered a substantial sum of money for the land by a merchant in the city, Pastor McDougall and the church leadership decided to remain in the heart of the city. During the reconstruction, the church met in the music hall on Franklin Street. Pastor McDougall laid out a grand design for the new Baptist Temple building, containing 2 large auditoriums, a restaurant-style kitchen, a gymnasium, and over 40 function rooms. Pastor McDougall had designed not only a church, but a community center. At the dedication of the new building, Pastor McDougall wrote, "The church we have built will be a place of worship, a powerhouse of evangelism, a center of religious education, a center of spiritual culture, a school of Christian music, and a social center under the finest influences." The new building was completed on November 13, 1927. With its grand opening, the name Second Baptist Church was dropped, and the church became officially known as what it had been commonly known as since 1847, the Baptist Temple. The reopening of the church was a major event in the life of the city, covered extensively by the newspapers of the day. Merchants even designed their advertisements to mention their part in the rebuilding of the magnificent structure. Over 1,000 people attended the dedication service. The overflow congregation listened to the exercises by means of a new amplification system. The week-long event included an organ recital, an orchestral concert, and basketball tournaments featuring leagues from the community. Less than 3 months later, in February of 1927, Fall River again was hit with a major fire, destroying a large part of the downtown area. The fire came within 1 block of the new church building before a shift in the wind changed the course of the flames. The Baptist Temple Church had been spared. While Pastor McDougall's contribution to Baptist Temple Church was tremendous, he nonetheless had been affected by the growing liberalism that was infiltrating Christianity at that time.
Well, a secular society they call the Roaring Twenties. Well, to some extent, that type of mentality penetrated other organizations, and the church was one of them. As I say, it was very socially inclined.
By 1932, Pastor McDougall's time at Baptist Temple drew to a close. A visionary and forward-thinking pastor, his vision for the church and its influence on the community is to be lauded. His departure, though painful, proved to be another positive step for the church.
Well, Barbara was mentioning how in the early 20s and 30s, in the 20s and into the early 30s, there was a good deal of social life in the church. This isn't exactly the same as what I'm about to say, but at that time, especially into the 20s and 30s and into the 40s, was developing in Protestantism what's known as the social gospel. And therefore, more conservative Protestants were beginning to take a stand against the idea that the gospel is really about doing good works. And so, as a reaction to the good works salvation idea, conservative evangelicals, who were known as fundamentalists at the time because they held to a certain number of specific fundamentals, and that's fine. Today, the word has become maligned and is kind of a dirty word. And in France, where we serve, if you talk about fundamentalists, it's a very bad term. I mean, it means somebody who's really way out. Originally, it didn't. But the conservative Baptists, for example, took a stand for salvation by faith alone in Christ, which is going back to the Reformation. That's pure Martin Luther, if you want to say that. And it's taken probably 50 or 60 years for the evangelical church to realize that doing social things is not bad. It's just that it's not the way to be saved. But that an outflow of our salvation is to live for Christ and do good works. And that's what Paul says in Ephesians 2:10. He said, we are saved by faith, and then it is a gift of God. It's not of works, but you are his workmanship. You've been made in Christ Jesus to do good works.
The church was at a crossroads. Many in the congregation liked and appreciated Pastor McDougall's ministry. He had, after all, given so much and had such a grand vision for the Baptist temple and its influence in the community. Others, alarmed at the liberal theology that was creeping into the church, turned to a strong and forceful leader who held to the fundamentals of the Christian faith. On January 1st, 1932, Dr. Gabriel Gidge, an Algerian by birth and former pastor of the Baptist Church of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, came to the Baptist Temple as its 12th pastor. Dr. Gidge immediately set about the business of leading the church back to sound biblical doctrine.
Now, we lost people. I mean, some of the people that were going to Baptist Temple in the 20s didn't like Dr. Gedge's, well, he was a forceful personality to begin with. And his changing everything around and adopting a much more conservative evangelical approach didn't appeal to everybody. I mean, the kids in Fall River that I knew went to Baptist Temple when I was little, but then they drifted off and their families didn't attend any longer.
During Pastor Gedge's ministry, the church grew, and its debt was greatly reduced. Giving and income were doubled. The church became affiliated with the National Association of Evangelicals and the Conservative Board of Foreign Missions of the Northern Baptist Convention. The Missionary Society of the church was reorganized, and a confession of faith was adopted. And a large neon cross was erected at the church's entrance, which for years was a landmark in the city. Baptist Temple for many years was known as the Church with the Neon Cross.
Was ist unser heutiges Deutschland? Nicht wieder schön und herrlich. Indem ich euch überblicke, weiß ich, mein Lebenskampf ist nicht umsonst gekämpft.
By the mid-1930s, international tensions had reached the breaking point, and Europe was once again thrust into war.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
America was once again at war, this time in Europe and in the Pacific, and once again young men from the Baptist Temple responded to their call of duty. 51 boys from Baptist Temple Church enlisted in various branches of the service, ready, willing, and able to defeat Hitler and Hirohito. Six of them would never return. By August of 1945, the Second World War had ended, and the following month, so did the ministry of Pastor Gabriel Gidge at the Baptist Temple. Before his departure, a brass cross, a duplicate of the one that had and continues to stand before Baptist Temple's pulpit, was presented to Dr. Gidge, to be willed to the church last served when Dr. Gidge's ministry finally came to an end. The central design, IHS, stands for the Latin dictum, Jesus, Savior of Men. Among the objects used in creating the duplicate cross were 3 French artillery shells and field artillery guns brought back by returning church members who had served during the war.
Gabriel Gidge was among the 44 men who knelt in prayer in Chicago that brought into being the Conservative Baptist Foreign Mission Society. And at that time, he had recently left Baptist Temple in Fall River and had taken the Baptist Temple Church in Brooklyn. And as things developed, when we finally, as a national group, developed a church association, he served as the very first president.
On January 6, 1946, Pastor Robert Carlberg, a Wheaton College and Eastern Seminary graduate and former pastor of the First Baptist Church in Allentown, Pennsylvania, became Baptist Temple's 13th and longest-serving pastor to date, beating out Pastor Jutten by 1 month.
When Dr. Carlberg came, it really was, I think, the highlight of the church years for that century. Was after the war. He came in January of 46. The war had ended the previous summer. And of course there was great hope that things would stabilize and that everything would be bigger and better and like that. And church was very, had a much more prominent place in the lives of people than it does today.
And I was very impressed with all the young people in those post-war years, post-World War II years, that went into the Lord's service, and some of them were real models for me as I look back now. And the church really had an excellent influence on a lot of us as we grew up.
Shortly after his arrival, Baptist Temple celebrated its 100th year anniversary. It was during this celebration that Baptist Temple commissioned its first 2 foreign missionaries, Miss Margaret Smith, a nurse who would go to war-torn Japan under the newly formed Conservative Baptist Foreign Missions Board, and Miss Ruth Curran, who under the Central American Mission would go to Honduras.
Well, I think that Pastor Carlberg had the greatest influence on my life, mostly because he was my pastor for almost 17 years, and during the very formative years of my life. The other pastors have always been very supportive, but he had the biggest influence. And you see, it was right through my seminary years, right through my adult years, practically the time I actually went to France. So I knew him better than anyone else. I grew up with especially his son Judd, and we were good friends and still have kept in touch, close touch.
It was also during the 100-year anniversary that the dedication of 9 memorial windows, commissioned during Pastor Gidge's tenure to Rambusch designers and craftsmen of New York, took place. Originally installed in the main sanctuary at 205 South Main Street, they are now at various locations in the new building. Some, sadly, are in storage. The Bible scenes in all of the windows depict the story of our Christian faith, beginning with the creation and closing with the prophetic scenes of the Ascension and the second coming of Jesus Christ. The creation window, given in memory of Alice G. Lincoln, and the Ten Commandments window, given in the memory of Evangeline S. Ramsbottom, are currently in the Asa Bronson Memorial Chapel. The 23rd Psalm, given in the memory of Herbert and Ann Holmes, and the Prophets, given in the memory of the 6 young men who gave their lives during World War II, are currently in the hallway leading to the gymnasium. The Crucifixion, given in memory of Marion and Everett Francis, is in the main sanctuary behind the pulpit. The Resurrection, given in the memory of Martha Maxim, is situated so it can be seen from the road outside the church building. 3 of these beautiful windows have been in storage for nearly 20 years. The first, the Nativity, was given in the memory of Charles and Wealthy Cook. The second, the Miracles, was given in remembrance of Baptist Temple's war veterans. And the third, the Ascension and Return, was given in the memory of Jonathan and Hannah Davis. With the end of the war and the commissioning of Baptist Temple's first 2 foreign missionaries, Pastor Carlberg began promoting missions, missionary guest speakers, and annual missionary conferences, igniting in the young people of that time a desire to serve the Lord overseas. Many young men and women growing up at Baptist Temple in the 1950s went on into missionary service, became pastors, or entered into full-time Christian work. Pastor Carlberg remained at Baptist Temple until 1962, becoming its longest-serving pastor.
One of the things that the Baptist Temple provided for me was a global worldview. And that may sound strange from a little Baptist church tucked away in southeastern Massachusetts. But believe it or not, because of the programs of the church, the emphasis on missions, the people who would visit the church, I began to see a much broader world than simply what was going on here in Fall River. Some examples of that. In my youth, my dad and the leadership said missionary conferences were very important. And so we would have missionaries come from all over the world who would speak about their ministry, their outreach, their witness for Christ. And that had a profound impact on my life. And of course, many of the young people in my era went on to serve as missionaries.
The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world.
The times were changing. With John F. Kennedy's presidency, America was entering the age of Camelot. The past was the past. The promise was the future. In 1963, Pastor Voley Piles assumed the pulpit of the Baptist Temple Church. Shortly after his arrival, the optimism and hope of the American people were shaken when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Americans entered into a period of self-doubt and questioning. Then things got worse. The United States became involved in a war with Vietnam. Disillusioned young people voiced their disapproval and, in a popular expression of the day, tuned out and turned on. They tuned out their parents, the church, and God, and turned on to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Many wondered if God was even there. Churches in America were unprepared to deal with many of these challenges. Yet, with God's help, Pastor Piles faced these challenges at Baptist Temple until his departure in 1966. Reverend C. Edward Cooper arrived from Pennsylvania in 1966 to become Baptist Temple's 15th pastor. The turbulence and social upheaval that marked that decade continued. God, the church, and Christianity were not only becoming less important to the average American, but were even being blamed for the state of the world. An energetic, vibrant, and caring shepherd, Pastor Cooper led Baptist Temple with wisdom and a good sense of humor through the end of the 1960s, faithfully proclaiming the gospel of Jesus in a world that was becoming increasingly disillusioned with him. Through the 1960s, the missionary conferences begun under Pastor Carlberg had continued, this time with Baptist Temple's homegrown missionaries returning to share with their church family what the Holy Spirit was doing in other parts of the world.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
In July of 1970, Baptist Temple called its first pastor, who had himself served on the foreign mission field. Reverend Robert Bruce Chapman of Fitchburg, Massachusetts, a graduate of Gordon College and Gordon Seminary, and recently returned from serving Christ in West Borneo, Indonesia, and as a faculty member of the Singapore Bible College, became the 16th pastor of the church. An energetic and enthusiastic man, Pastor Chapman sought new and innovative ways to minister to his people and to reach out into the community.
One thing when I came to Fall River, it seemed that the evangelical influence was rather minimal. And my associate Rick Conklin and I sat down and we talked a long time about what we could do to make a difference. And so we came up with the idea of a volleyball marathon. And we contacted Third Baptist Church and invited them to be our opponents to try to break the world record of a continuous volleyball game. The point was we decided also that when it was all over, we would hold a mass rally at Diamond High School and invite a gospel team to come in. We started playing in the back portion of the little lawn that Third Baptist possessed, and then we moved the game in motion from Third Baptist down to Baptist Temple. And so the procession with police escort came down through the streets, and we reestablished the game behind Baptist Temple, and on it went for the entire week. A lot of the kids actually slept in the synagogue that we were using for a youth ministry. During the week, it was an interesting response from the community. A very well-known women's volleyball team that represented retired women showed up and played for a period of time. The fire department, with the sirens blowing, came down and played as well. And when these guest players arrived, then Baptist Temple and Third Baptist would be on the same side. There was a court contact directly with the radio station, and the point totals or the progress of the game was announced throughout the week. out front of the church, Rick Conklin parked his Model T and kept the score out there as well. And it was a fascinating time. And probably, without people recognizing it, there was not another event that we did that resulted in more conversions.
Pastor Chapman left Baptist Temple in 1975 to assume the pastorate of a church in Minnesota. He was greatly missed by those who knew and loved him, but we would see him again. In October of 1975, Reverend Harry R. Egner of Philadelphia, a graduate of Philadelphia College of the Bible, Gordon College, and Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and with 21 years of pastoral ministry behind him, became Baptist Temple's 17th pastor. It was during Pastor Egner's tenure that the church fell into disagreement over the direction and funding of certain ministries. And unable to resolve the differences, many members left the church. It was not the first or necessarily the biggest split the church had faced, but it was one that has left its wounds on the church to this very day. Pastor Egner served the Lord at Baptist Temple until 1983. In 1984, Reverend Lowell R. Barnes of Colorado came to Baptist Temple to be its 18th pastor. He stayed just over 2 years, leaving in early January 1987. In 1983, former missionary to Brazil, Reverend G. Hubert Morden, had arrived at Baptist Temple to begin work establishing a Portuguese church. After Pastor Barnes' departure, Pastor Morden was asked to serve as interim pastor until another pastor was called. He remained the interim pastor for 4 years. With the popularity of shopping malls and the poor parking situation in the center of the city, downtown Fall River had for some time ceased to be a desirable location for the church. After being on the market for 12 years, in 1987, the Baptist Temple building was sold. With the responsibility of 2 churches on his shoulders, Pastor Morden now assumed the responsibility for erecting a new building and finding a place for both churches to worship in the interim.
Well, we needed a place to meet, and we were looking around at various possibilities, and there was a Portuguese Baptist church on Rodman Street, and that church was without a pastor. They had a congregation but no pastor. We had a pastor and congregation and no building. So we kind of made a marriage, and we used their building for 2.5 years. Moved in, it was rather difficult, but I had the privilege of pastoring 3 churches at that time. And we had a great time with the folk from the Portuguese Baptist Church on Rodman Street. We did a lot of renovation there as well that was necessary for the size group that we had, but we had a great time.
In 1990, the new Baptist Temple building was completed. Situated in a residential part of the city, as was the original structure when first built in 1840. The new location affords easy accessibility to and from the highway and ample parking.
Big problem on South Main Street, Bob, I'm sure you know what that was. Parking. We had a postage stamp size parking lot in the back. And I can remember going, standing in church saying, "Bring your tickets to me, please." On a Sunday morning, there the people were in church, and the police were going around and put a ticket on every car So they'd bring all their tickets to me, and I'd take them to City Hall, and I'd say, do you want me to pay for all these now? So here we have that tremendous advantage of the parking lot. Now if we just had all the cars to fill it, we'd be thrilled.
During the transitional period, the search for a pastor to replace Pastor Barnes had been put on hold. In 1991, Pastor Morden was asked and accepted the pastorate of the Baptist Temple Church, becoming its 19th pastor. He continued in that capacity until early 2002, when he decided to work exclusively with the Portuguese church, Templo Batista Português, which still shares the church building with us. In July of 2002, recent seminary graduate Mark C. Skillen arrived as Baptist Temple's 20th pastor. He was ordained by the church shortly after his arrival. He was a gifted speaker and a personable and caring man. However, a fundamental doctrinal difference arose that set him at odds with the church leadership and the Conservative Baptist Association. The difference could not be resolved, and Pastor Skillen left Baptist Temple in January of 2005. Since his departure, former pastor Robert Chapman has returned as Baptist Temple's interim pastor. The search for God's man for Baptist Temple continues. The world has changed. People have changed. We live in a world that is increasingly hostile to Christ and His church. Many Christians today believe church programs designed to draw people into the church building are the way to grow the church. Yet, while programs may draw unbelievers in, God's plan is to keep people in and transform their lives by the power of the word preached. Pastor Jutten regularly drew over 1,000 people to the church to hear the gospel plainly and powerfully presented. Programs and ministries, carefully planned and prayerfully administered, may have a role to play, but in the end, it's the power of the gospel of Jesus, preached to hungry hearts, that will win souls for Christ and build a strong and vibrant church. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, beginning in verse 18, we read, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, the power of God. For it is written that I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent." Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For since in the wisdom of God the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. The gospel of Jesus Christ is as vibrant and alive today as it ever was, and the preaching of the gospel still has the power to change lives and to build the Church of Jesus Christ.
Lord, bless the Baptist temple. We've served you through the years. Come foreign tribulation, we felt your presence here. In times past you have taught us to turn our hearts towards thee. Lord, help us not to falter and clear our eyes to see. Our pastor, Asa Bronson, he stood for dignity. The working man should have time to train his family. The black man bound in slavery, he too must be set free.